There are moments in suburban life when the ordinary reveals just how petty, vindictive, and absurd people can become. For most, a neighborhood is a place of peace. For some, it's a battleground of rules, power plays, and personal vendettas. My story began with nothing more than a simple parking spot. One slab of pavement in front of my home, a space that had been mine for years, with no disputes, no issues, and no complaints, until the Homeowners Association decided they wanted it for themselves. It started with a letter. A polite but firm notice slipped under my door, claiming that the space was no longer part of my property. According to the HOA, new community regulations had reclassified that strip of asphalt as common area. I was expected to stop using it immediately. Instead, they declared, the space would be reserved for community guests, managed, of course, by the board. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Surely, the HOA couldn't just take something from me without due process. But when I checked the letter against the association's newly published parking guidelines, there it was in print, a neat little section declaring the reassignment of certain curbside spaces. Mine was highlighted. For years, that spot had been more than just pavement. It was where I parked my truck when I came home from long shifts. It was where visiting family parked during the holidays. It was part of the rhythm of my life, unchallenged and unquestioned. And now, because someone on the board wanted to tighten their grip on the neighborhood, I was expected to surrender it without argument. At first, I ignored them. I parked as usual, assuming they would come to their senses. But within a week, warning notices appeared on my windshield. Threats of fines. Threats of towing. They were escalating, pushing harder with each passing day. Behind the scenes, I began to notice subtle shifts. The HOA board members suddenly seemed more smug when I passed them on the street. Conversations among neighbors quieted when I approached. Whispers filled the air. Whispers about how someone wasn't following the rules. It was clear they were trying to isolate me, to make me feel like the problem. But what they didn't know was that I had been paying attention for years. I knew how sloppy their record-keeping was. I knew how poorly the original developer had documented easements, boundaries, and rights of way. And I knew, thanks to my background in land surveying, exactly where the cracks in their foundation were. Instead of raging, I started digging. Old property deeds, survey maps, municipal records, anything that would tell me the truth about that strip of pavement. And the deeper I went, the more interesting things became. The spot they claimed wasn't theirs at all. In fact, the entire road leading into the neighborhood had never been properly transferred to the HOA. The developer, years ago, had filed an incomplete set of documents. The association had assumed control without ever securing legal ownership, which meant, technically, the road, and every parking space along it, wasn't theirs to regulate. It was mine. A discovery like that doesn't just shift the balance. It detonates it. But at this point, I didn't reveal my hand. I let them keep pushing. The warnings turned into fines. They mailed invoices claiming I owed hundreds of dollars for violations. They even had the nerve to threaten legal action. All the while, I parked my truck in the same spot, calm as ever. Neighbors watched from behind their blinds, waiting for a showdown. And still, I said nothing. I let the tension build, brick by brick, until the HOA's arrogance reached its peak. Because I knew that when I finally responded, it wouldn't just be about a parking spot. It would be about everything they thought they controlled, and when I struck back, I intended to make sure they never forgot the lesson. The HOA believed they had power. They believed they could rewrite reality with a few lines of policy. But in their haste to grab what wasn't theirs, they had overlooked the very ground beneath their feet. And soon, they were going to find out that the ground didn't belong to them. It belonged to me. The battle lines were drawn, though they didn't know it yet. They thought they had cornered me with fines and threats. They thought they had pushed me into submission. But what they had actually done was open the door to a much larger war, one that would unravel the very foundation of their neighborhood. And it all began with a single parking spot. By the time the third fine arrived in the mail, the HOA believed they had won. The letter was curt and threatening, stamped with their logo, demanding immediate payment or escalation to a collections agency. They expected fear. They expected compliance. What they didn't expect was silence. I paid nothing. I ignored every notice. And instead of panic, I spent my evenings combing through county records, tracing the paper trail of ownership that stretched back decades. Most homeowners never bother with such things. They trust the HOA, assuming the board knows what they're doing. But I knew better. Bureaucracy leaves cracks, and in those cracks, you can find leverage, and leverage is exactly what I found. The original developer of the subdivision had gone bankrupt midway through construction. In their scramble to offload assets, they had filed incomplete plats and half-finished transfers. The HOA, years later, stepped into the vacuum, declaring control over everything that looked like common property. They never checked the records, never secured legal transfer, never asked whether they had the right to govern the road itself. Buried in the archives, stamped and forgotten, was the deed. The road, every inch from the entrance sign to the cul-de-sac, had reverted to private ownership after the developer's bankruptcy. And years ago, when I bought my house, my parcel included not just the structure and the lawn, but the easement rights to the road itself. In plain language, I didn't just own my house, I owned the street. It was almost laughable reading those papers while the HOA tried to fine me for parking on their asphalt. Their rules had no teeth because the ground they stood on didn't belong to them. They were trespassers in their own fantasy kingdom, enforcing laws that held no legal weight. I could have stopped there, satisfied with the knowledge that I held the winning card. But arrogance deserves consequence. The HOA board hadn't just been mistaken. They had tried to bully me, to shame me, to drag my name through the mud for daring to resist. That kind of behavior demanded exposure. So I began preparing my counterattack. The first step was quiet. Consultations with a property attorney, confirming what I already knew. His reaction told me everything. After reviewing the documents, he leaned back in disbelief and said there was no question. The HOA had no jurisdiction over the road. If I wanted, I could bar access. I could revoke their assumed authority entirely. I could, with one filing, erase their control. Still, I waited. I let the HOA continue their game. They sent more fines, which piled up unopened on my desk. They threatened towing, but no truck ever came, because technically they had no right to authorize it. Neighbors whispered, confused as the board fumed about my non-compliance. The stage was being set, and all I had to do was let their pride build the pressure. Finally, the moment came. At the next HOA meeting, I arrived with a folder under my arm. The board, smug and ready for confrontation, expected me to fold under their authority. Instead, I laid the deed on the table and explained, calmly and clearly, that their jurisdiction stopped at my property line, and that the road they thought they owned had never belonged to them in the first place. The silence that followed was deafening. The board scrambled, insisting there must be some mistake, some technicality. But the documents were undeniable. The very foundation of their power crumbled with every line of text I read aloud. Their rules, their fines, their threats. They had been building castles in the air, with no land beneath them. The panic spread quickly. Some board members tried to downplay it, claiming it wasn't a big deal. Others looked genuinely shaken, realizing how badly they had overstepped. And behind their eyes I saw fear. Fear of losing control. Fear of being exposed to the entire neighborhood as frauds. But I wasn't finished. I informed them that since I held ownership of the road, I had every right to declare it unbuildable. No expansions, no alterations, no new paving without my approval. Their dream of micromanaging every inch of the neighborhood had just collided with the reality that they were powerless on the most basic level. The HOA had stolen a parking spot. In return, I had stolen their crown. As I left that meeting, folder still in hand, the air buzzed with whispers. Neighbors who had watched me from a distance were now turning curious, sensing that the balance of power had shifted. The board members, once smug and untouchable, sat stunned, their empire unraveling before their eyes. But this was only the beginning. Because once you pull on a loose thread, the entire sweater starts to come apart. and I had just yanked with both hands. After that meeting, the neighborhood changed overnight. Word spread quickly, faster than I expected. By the next morning, whispers had turned into full-blown conversations. Neighbors gathered in driveways, on porches, and around mailboxes, piecing together what they had heard. The man they thought was simply refusing to follow HOA rules had, in fact, revealed that the HOA had no legal authority over the street at all. For years, the association had built its identity on control. They dictated what color shutters could be painted, what kind of mailbox was acceptable, even how long grass could grow before fines appeared. People had grumbled, but most complied. It was easier to pay a small fine than wage a long war. But now, the illusion had been shattered. If the board didn't even own the road beneath their feet, what else were they bluffing about? The fallout was immediate. Homeowners who had been quietly resentful suddenly found their voices. A neighbor down the street stopped paying fines for leaving his trash bins out a day too long. Another family painted their fence without permission, daring the board to challenge them. Slowly, defiantly, people began testing the limits of the HOA's power and finding, to their surprise, that the board had no teeth. Meanwhile, the board scrambled. They sent frantic emails insisting that everything was under control, that the road issue was just a technical misunderstanding. But their authority had already been undermined. People didn't trust them anymore, and mistrust spreads like wildfire. I watched from my porch, quietly amused, as the board tried to hold their empire together. They called emergency meetings. They tried to spin the story, claiming I had misinterpreted the documents. But the deed in my possession was public record, and those who were curious enough confirmed it themselves. The HOA couldn't hide behind bluster anymore. Still, arrogance doesn't die easily. Instead of admitting defeat, the board doubled down. They circulated new letters accusing me of destabilizing the community. They warned that property values would plummet if homeowners stopped respecting the rules. It was an attempt to paint me as the villain, a reckless neighbor tearing down the fabric of the neighborhood for personal gain. But the more they pushed that narrative, the more foolish they looked. Because I wasn't the one sending fines. I wasn't the one threatening families. I wasn't the one lying about what I owned. All I had done was reveal the truth. And in that truth, the HOA's empire had crumbled. Still, I didn't relax. I knew desperate people often make reckless moves, and the board was nothing if not desperate. Sure enough, one evening I returned home to find a bright orange sticker slapped across my truck windshield, a notice declaring that I was in violation of community parking standards and that my vehicle would be towed within 48 hours. The audacity was almost funny. They knew they had no legal right to touch the road, yet they were bluffing again, hoping intimidation would win. What they didn't realize was that this time, I was done playing quiet. I took photographs, documented the sticker, and called my attorney. If they so much as touched my vehicle, they wouldn't just be overstepping. They'd be liable for damages. And I was more than ready to drag their organization through court. At the same time, I began preparing something bigger. If the HOA wanted to pretend they had control, I would remind them just how little they had. With the road in my name, I filed paperwork with the county to update zoning restrictions. The result, the road was declared unbuildable for any future expansion. No widening, no speed bumps, no new access points. It was a surgical strike, and it landed right where it hurt. The HOA had been planning to expand visitor parking, one of their pet projects, to accommodate new families moving in. Without my approval, that project was dead. Their carefully laid plans dissolved with a single line of ink on a county form. And as news of this spread, homeowners began to laugh behind closed doors. The board's once untouchable authority was now the subject of jokes. Their fear tactics, their endless meetings, their heavy-handed rules, all of it looked ridiculous in the light of their failure. The cracks in the neighborhood weren't just visible, they were widening. Friendships frayed as neighbors who had once been silent enforcers of the board's rules now turned on each other. Some clung desperately to the HOA's authority, convinced that without it, chaos would reign. Others saw freedom in the unraveling, eager to live without constant oversight. And me? I sat back and let the storm build. I hadn't asked for war, but since it had come to my door, I intended to win it decisively. The HOA wanted a fight over a parking spot. What they got instead was a rebellion, and it was only the beginning. End of Chapter 3. Next, Chapter 4 will show the HOA's desperate retaliation attempt, legal maneuvers, and how the narrator escalates by using the road ownership to full advantage. The board's pride had taken a beating, and pride rarely goes quietly. After weeks of scrambling, whispering, and pretending everything was under control, the HOA decided it was time to retaliate. They couldn't admit defeat, not publicly, not after years of ruling the neighborhood with an iron fist. So they did what they thought would scare me into compliance. They tried to bring the law into it. A certified letter arrived in my mailbox, thick with legal jargon. The HOA had retained counsel, and they were pursuing remedies for my refusal to abide by community rules. The letter accused me of undermining property values, disrupting the peace, and deliberately antagonizing the board. It ended with a threat of litigation if I didn't cease parking in the disputed space and pay the mountain of fines they had stacked against me. I read it once, then again, and then I laughed. Their so-called case was built on air. They had no jurisdiction over the road, no deed to stand on, no legal claim to enforce. They were banking on one thing: intimidation. They wanted me to panic at the sight of a lawyer's letter. But panic wasn't what I felt. What I felt was opportunity. Because once they brought lawyers into the picture, they opened themselves up to scrutiny, and scrutiny was the last thing they needed. I handed the letter to my attorney, who barely suppressed a grin as he drafted a response. He reminded them, in precise legal terms, that the HOA had no authority over the road and that their fines were unenforceable. He warned them that any attempt to tow my vehicle would result in a lawsuit for damages and trespass. And, for good measure, he added that their repeated threats could be construed as harassment. The message was clear. If they wanted war in court, I was more than ready to oblige. But that wasn't all. My attorney suggested something brilliant, something the HOA hadn't considered. Since I owned the road, I had the right to regulate access. If I wanted, I could technically impose restrictions on the HOA itself. They used my road every single day, collecting dues, enforcing rules, and pretending they were in charge. But without my permission, they were nothing more than trespassers. That idea stuck with me. The board had tried to bully me by flexing their fake authority. Now it was time to remind them what real authority looked like. So I filed a notice with the county, officially declaring the road as private property with restricted access. It was still open for residents, of course. I wasn't out to punish my neighbors. But the HOA, as an entity, no longer had rights to use it for enforcement, construction, or regulation. The board's clipboard-wielding inspectors who walked the street looking for violations. They were now trespassing. The volunteers who measured grass lengths and snapped photos of mailboxes. Trespassing. Their entire system of control, built on the assumption they owned the street, had just been legally cut off at the knees. When the news hit, chaos followed. Some homeowners were thrilled. They cheered quietly, knowing the HOA's reign was slipping away. Others panicked, convinced that without the board's oversight, the neighborhood would descend into disorder. And the board? They were furious. They called an emergency meeting, trying to rally support. Flyers went out, stuffed into mailboxes, claiming that I was endangering the community. They said I was a selfish troublemaker who didn't care about anyone else's property values. They tried to paint me as the villain, hoping fear would bring people back to their side. But the harder they pushed, the more desperate they looked. Homeowners remembered years of fines for petty violations, years of power trips over mailbox colors and fence heights. Suddenly, the board's cries about protecting property values rang hollow. People were starting to ask the same question. If they didn't even own the road, what else had they been lying about? Meanwhile, I kept parking in my spot, undisturbed. The orange stickers stopped appearing. The threats grew quieter. And slowly, I realized something. The board wasn't just fighting me anymore. They were fighting themselves. Internal cracks had begun to show. Some members wanted to push harder, to keep escalating. Others, sensing inevitable defeat, wanted to back down before lawsuits drained their coffers. What had once been a unified front was splintering into factions, and I knew it was only a matter of time before their own infighting destroyed them from the inside. The HOA had set out to teach me a lesson about rules. Instead, they were about to learn a lesson about ownership, and I was only just getting started. By the time summer rolled around, the HOA was unrecognizable. The once confident board that strutted through the neighborhood with clipboards and authority had fractured into chaos. Their meetings, which used to be stiff, orderly, and smug, had turned into shouting matches. Half the board wanted to keep fighting me, to push the legal angle even though their case was weak. The other half wanted to surrender, terrified of draining the association's funds on a battle they knew they couldn't win. I didn't even have to attend the meetings anymore. Neighbors filled me in. Some recounted how board members screamed at one another, pointing fingers over who had failed to notice the road ownership issue in the first place. Others described members storming out, slamming doors, and resigning on the spot. The very people who had once controlled the neighborhood with an iron fist were now tearing themselves apart. Meanwhile, the residents grew bolder. The family with the trash cans left outside, they never moved them again. The couple with the fence, they painted it bright blue, and when the board sent a warning letter, they ignored it. Others followed suit. Mailboxes sprouted unique designs, lawns grew a little wilder, and holiday decorations started appearing weeks early. The HOA's grip had been broken, and in the vacuum, freedom spread. But not everyone was happy. A handful of die-hard rule followers clung desperately to the board, convinced that the neighborhood would collapse without strict enforcement. They cornered neighbors, scolding them for non-compliance. They spread rumors about me, whispering that I was a selfish troublemaker who would ruin property values. But their words carried little weight now. When the foundation of power crumbles, fear loses its teeth. The board made one last desperate attempt to claw back authority. They called for a special vote, claiming that the community needed to restore order by amending the bylaws. Their proposal was bold. They wanted to levy a special assessment, charging every homeowner thousands of dollars to hire outside counsel and fight me in court. They framed it as a necessary defense of the neighborhood. But the homeowners had had enough. When the vote came, attendance was higher than anyone could remember. People who had ignored HOA politics for years showed up, fueled by anger, resentment, or sheer curiosity. The board tried to argue, their voices cracking as they warned of chaos if the vote failed. But when the ballots were counted, the result was overwhelming. The proposal failed by a landslide. The HOA's last weapon had been stripped from their hands. Without funds, without community support, and without legal standing, they were powerless. In the weeks that followed, resignations poured in. One by one, board members stepped down, unable to face the humiliation of their collapse. Those who remained were little more than figureheads, clinging to titles that no longer meant anything. The association was a shell of its former self, a ghost of the empire it once pretended to be. I watched all of this unfold from the comfort of my porch, parked truck safely in their stolen spot. I hadn't set out to dismantle an HOA. I had only wanted peace. But when they tried to bully me, I had pushed back, and in doing so, I had exposed the rot at the core of their power. The irony wasn't lost on me. All of this, every shouting match, every resignation, every act of rebellion had begun with a single parking space. A trivial piece of pavement that the HOA had thought they could take. In their arrogance, they hadn't just lost the spot. They had lost everything. But as satisfying as it was to watch them crumble, I knew the story wasn't finished. Because while the HOA was in shambles, the board still had a few loyal supporters. And people desperate to cling to power don't give up easily. The question now wasn't whether I had beaten them. I had. The question was what they would do next, and how far they were willing to go to try to take back what they had lost. And I had a feeling their final act would be the most desperate of all. End of Chapter 5. Next. Chapter 6 will bring the conclusion. The HOA's last-ditch retaliation attempt. How it backfires. and how the narrator cements their ultimate victory over the board once and for all. When power slips away, those who once held it rarely accept defeat gracefully. Even with the board in shambles, even with neighbors openly ignoring their rules, the last remaining members of the HOA weren't ready to let go. They still believed, somehow, that they could claw their way back to control. Their desperation came in the form of one final, reckless stunt. It happened on a Saturday morning. I woke to the sound of engines rumbling outside my window. Looking out, I saw two tow trucks idling near the curb, their drivers looking uneasy as board members waved clipboards and barked orders. And there, at the center of their attention, was my truck. The board was making good on their old threats. They were trying to tow my vehicle off their road, even though they knew full well the road didn't belong to them. They were counting on shock and force to achieve what paperwork and threats couldn't. But what they hadn't counted on was preparation. I had been expecting something like this, and that morning I was ready. Within minutes, my attorney was on the phone with the towing company, warning them that they were about to commit trespass and theft on private property. At the same time, I stepped outside with my folder of documents presenting the deed to the tow truck drivers directly. Their hesitation grew into outright refusal. They weren't about to get dragged into a legal nightmare on behalf of a failing HOA. The scene dissolved into chaos. Board members shouted, waving their arms, insisting they had authority. Neighbors gathered on porches and lawns, recording the spectacle on their phones. And finally, under the weight of documentation, legal threats, and public humiliation, the tow trucks pulled away, leaving the board standing in the middle of the street, red-faced and defeated. That was the final nail in the coffin. Word of the failed towing spread like wildfire. Within hours, videos of the incident were circulating through group chats and social media pages. The HOA's last attempt at control had backfired spectacularly, exposing them as reckless, powerless, and out of touch. After that, the collapse was swift. The remaining board members resigned within days, too embarrassed to continue. Homeowners voted to dissolve the association entirely, citing mismanagement, abuse of power, and financial irresponsibility. The bylaws, once wielded like weapons, were shredded and discarded. The neighborhood didn't fall into chaos as the board had always warned it would. Instead, life became simpler. People painted their homes as they pleased, parked without fear of fines, and lived without constant surveillance. The community didn't collapse. It thrived. As for me, I parked my truck in the same spot every night, a quiet reminder of how the battle had begun. I hadn't asked for a war, but when one came to my doorstep, I fought it with patience, knowledge, and precision. The HOA had underestimated me, and in doing so, they had destroyed themselves. Looking back, it's almost comical. All of this, the meetings, the fines, the lawsuits, the collapse, started with a single slab of pavement. A parking spot they thought they could take. But in trying to steal what was mine, they revealed the truth. They had no power, no ground to stand on, and no future. I owned the road beneath their feet, and in the end, that made all the difference. The HOA was gone. The street was mine, and the neighborhood was finally free.